When people talk about San Francisco in 1915, they almost always focus on what was happening above ground. They talk about the Panama-Pacific International Exposition, the Palace of Fine Arts, the glittering Tower of Jewels, and the millions of visitors who came to see a city, proving it had risen again after the devastation of the 1906 earthquake. That is the version of the story most people know. But the more interesting story, the one that barely made it into newspapers and today survives mostly in scattered notes and overlooked references, started down below the waterfront. It began with a practical decision, not some grand mystery. Engineers were told to reclaim land along the bay for the exposition grounds. The job was straightforward on paper. Dredge the harbour floor, move the sediment, build up marshy sections and create solid ground for the fair. Simple enough. But almost as soon as the crews began cutting into the mudflats and the shallow bay bottom, they ran into something they were not expecting. Beneath layers of silt and packed sediment deeper than anyone thought ordinary waterfront construction should reach, workers began exposing structures. Not old pilings, not random debris, not the kind of leftovers you would expect from an active port city rebuilding after disaster. These were metal frameworks, cylindrical housings, embedded installations that did not match any known infrastructure listed in the records of the time. And that is where things start to get strange. The design did not line up with ordinary utility systems. It did not resemble familiar harbour equipment. It did not even look much like the kinds of power or signal systems American engineers of the period would have expected to see. Publicly, almost none of this was emphasized. The city had a triumphant image to present to the world, and the official story was about progress, recovery, and spectacle. So while the public marveled at grand architecture and dazzling lights, something much quieter was unfolding beneath the bay. In private notes from the period, the same kind of language appears again and again. Pre-existing installations, unexpected configuration, origin unknown. Those phrases matter, because later the authorized explanation would flatten all of this into something much less dramatic. Officials would describe the discoveries as abandoned telegraph equipment, maritime signal remnants, or misunderstood debris from older construction. In other words, nothing worth paying much attention to, case closed, except the surviving dredging photographs suggest otherwise. In those images, you can see workers standing beside metal tower-like structures set deep into the bedrock below the bay floor. You can see fitted sections joined with a level of uniformity that feels oddly precise for the era. You can see cylindrical housings with internal arrangements that do not really resemble standard industrial equipment from early 20th century San Francisco. And the more material that was uncovered, the less it looked like random abandoned infrastructure, and the more it looked like something deliberate, something organized, something that had been submerged and forgotten long before the exposition ever began. At first, the crews tried to explain what they were finding in the simplest terms possible. That makes sense. Engineers do that. Workers do that. Everybody does that. If you find something unexpected, you try to fit it into the categories you already know. Maybe these were old pier foundations, maybe cable housings, maybe strange leftovers from pre-earthquake waterfront development. But as more notes piled up and more of the buried systems came into view, that simple explanation became harder to hold on to. The inconsistencies kept building. Why were some of the frameworks made with tolerances so tight they seemed beyond what local fabrication shops were known for at the time? Why did certain components appear nearly identical, as if they had been mass-produced with unusual consistency rather than shaped one by one? Why did some of these systems extend far beyond the footprint of any recorded pier wharf or utility route? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why did so much of it appear sophisticated in a way no one could comfortably explain? By 1915, San Francisco was modernizing fast. Electrification was expanding. Infrastructure was improving. That much is true. But what appeared beneath portions of the bay did not look like a rough early stage of that development. It looked like something else, something engineered for energy transmission in a form contemporary crews did not immediately recognize. No one in the notes was openly saying they had uncovered some lost civilization or forgotten advanced technology. That language would have sounded absurd, even reckless. But even without dramatic claims, the implication was still there. Quietly, cautiously, the workers were recognizing that someone had built a system here before. Not just simple telegraph lines, not basic lighting hardware, something more complex. And then, as the evidence grew, the descriptions became less detailed. That is another part of this story that stands out. You would think that if engineers stumbled across unusual and highly organized buried structures during one of the most ambitious construction efforts in the city's history, documentation would become more thorough, more careful, more complete. But instead, the opposite seems to happen. Reports get shorter, language becomes vaguer, wide-view photographs become rarer. The record starts narrowing right when the discoveries appear to become harder to explain. Then in the middle of 1915, parts of the excavation zones were covered back over. Sediment was pumped in where foundation work required it. New landfill spread over sections that had only recently been exposed. Installations that had emerged from darkness were returned to it. And just like that, much of what had been uncovered beneath the bay disappeared again. What survives now is frustratingly incomplete. A scattering of notes, a limited number of photographs, a few references preserved in technical correspondence. But even from those fragments, a pattern begins to show itself. The pattern is what makes this story hard to dismiss completely. The infrastructure appears too advanced for what we are told it was. The components seem too precise for the accepted timeline. The engineering methods feel less like early experimentation and more like the inheritance of an already developed system. The deeper the dredging teams went, the less the bay floor looked like a messy graveyard of urban debris, and the more it began to resemble pieces of a buried grid. And that grid did not behave like random leftover construction. Once crews moved beyond the first recognizable layers beneath the waterfront, they expected ordinary results. Mud-old pilings, ship fragments, maybe a few forgotten remains from earlier shoreline development. Instead, they began finding installations that seemed to follow repeating spatial patterns. Different sites along the waterfront showed similar spacing, similar angular relationships, similar layout logic. That should not happen by accident. Separate builders, separate decades, separate purposes are usually visible in the ground. Infrastructure grows unevenly. Cities layer themselves chaotically. But what appeared beneath the bay seemed to suggest a more unified arrangement. Components in one area aligned with installations in another. Conduits appeared to follow consistent trajectories even when separated by large distances of open water. It was as if the workers had not uncovered isolated wreckage at all. It was as if they had touched the remains of a system. And once that possibility entered the picture, even quietly, even cautiously, the entire meaning of the dredging work began to change. Because now the question was no longer just what had been found. The question was, who built it when it was built, and why so much effort seemed to go into putting it back out of sight once it started coming to light. As the dredging continued, the discoveries became harder to explain away as isolated fragments of forgotten waterfront construction. The deeper the crews pushed into the bay floor, the more the patterns sharpened. What they were exposing did not look random. It did not look improvised. It did not even look like the kind of patchwork infrastructure a growing city usually leaves behind. It looked organized. That detail matters more than almost anything else. Old cities are messy beneath the surface. Utilities cross each other. Foundations get reused. Broken systems are abandoned and built over. One decade rarely lines up neatly with the next. But beneath sections of San Francisco Bay in 1915, workers were uncovering installations that seemed to obey the same geometric logic from one location to another, near the marina, along portions of the Embarcadero, in waters tied to areas later associated with expansion and reclamation. Different points, same relationships, similar spacing, similar alignment, similar engineering language. That is not how accidental debris behaves. And once the workers started recognizing that consistency, the atmosphere around the excavation seems to have changed. At first, the teams had been treating each discovery as a separate puzzle piece. Maybe this one was part of an old pier. Maybe that one had belonged to maritime signaling equipment. Maybe another was tied to some forgotten experiment from a utility company. But those explanations became weaker each time a new section appeared and matched the logic of the previous one. What they were seeing looked less like leftovers and more like the remains of a grid. Then came the structures that pushed the mystery even further. Beneath the expected layers of mud-loose stone and ship-related debris, crews began encountering installations that simply did not resemble familiar equipment from the documented history of the city. Some were much larger than expected, Some were much more mechanically complex. Some seemed almost excessively precise, as if they had been engineered with a level of mathematical regularity that stood apart from the rougher industrial workmanship people usually associate with the early 20th century. There were cylindrical housings with near-perfect symmetry, metal surfaces that appeared unusually smooth, fitted joints that looked more exact than workers expected to see in objects supposedly left behind by older harbour construction. Even if some of these impressions were amplified by the shock of discovery, the repeated emphasis on precision is difficult to ignore. And then the most puzzling interpretation began to circulate among the engineers themselves. Wireless transmission. Not everyone used those exact words in the same way, but the idea appears in private descriptions often enough to stand out. Some of the exposed frameworks did not seem designed for cable routing. They did not appear to depend on obvious wired connections. Instead, they included geometric coil-like arrangements, chambered interiors, and grounding features that suggested something broader than conventional signal infrastructure. To the people looking at them in 1915, these systems appeared designed not simply to carry current through wires, but to broadcast or distribute energy in some other way. That was a radical implication, because according to the accepted timeline, San Francisco was not supposed to have had anything like a large-scale wireless energy system beneath its bay floor. There is no standard municipal story about some forgotten experimental network hidden underwater. No well-known company archive describing such installations. No neat historical chapter explaining why crews preparing land for a World's Fair would suddenly find structures that seemed closer to conceptual energy transmission devices than ordinary harbour remains. And yet the surviving visual evidence seems to have pointed in that direction strongly enough that even conservative observers struggled to fit it into familiar categories. In some photographs, the workers appear tiny next to vertical tower-like structures rising from the excavated ground. In others, exposed components look so deliberate and so uniform that later viewers have argued they resemble experimental electrical systems more than ordinary industrial supports. Coil arrangements, resonant-looking chambers, fitted housings, repeating geometries. None of it sits comfortably inside the usual explanation of abandoned debris. But perhaps the most revealing part of the story is not what appears in the photographs. It is what barely appears in the formal records afterward. If these structures really were ordinary, why were they not documented in fuller technical detail? Why do some of the surviving descriptions fall back on vague labels when the visual evidence suggests something more elaborate? Why are certain installations reduced to phrases like maritime remains or earlier equipment when the men standing beside them clearly seem to be dealing with much more complicated structures? That silence is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Because bureaucracy usually loves detail, especially when public money engineering work and major civic development are involved. If the discoveries had been routine detailed classification would have helped settle the matter quickly. Instead, the record seems to thin out. Drawings become selective. Descriptions shorten. The most unusual features are either generalized or omitted. That kind of narrowing can happen for many reasons: confusion, time pressure, institutional caution, embarrassment over not knowing what was found. But whatever the reason, it leaves behind a strange impression. The more unusual the discoveries became, the less clearly they were described. And that impression deepens when you look at the physical features that reportedly raised concern among the crews. Some surfaces appeared too smooth, some joints too exact, some windings or repeating elements too uniform to feel comfortably hand-assembled. Again, none of this proves impossible technology or some sensational lost civilization, but it does create tension with the standard explanation. If these were merely old local leftovers, why did they appear so refined? Why did they seem to reflect manufacturing precision that workers themselves found noteworthy? The deeper the dredging went, the harder it became to preserve a clean linear story of San Francisco's electrical development. Instead of a simple progression from primitive systems to modern ones, the bay floor seemed to reveal something layered, interrupted, and strangely sophisticated. Installation after installation hinted at a buried infrastructure that was not easy to place in the known sequence of regional industry. And once that possibility started to take shape, another troubling detail came into focus. These systems did not all look like they had been casually dumped or accidentally submerged. Many appeared integrated into the ground itself. Some extended downward into bedrock. Others stretched laterally in ways that suggested planned connection rather than random collapse. The relationship between components implied design, layout, intention. In other words, these may not have been broken pieces scattered by time. They may have been the remains of something that once functioned as a whole. That possibility changed the meaning of the entire reclamation project. Above ground, San Francisco was building a symbol of rebirth, confidence, and modern achievement. Below ground, workers may have been cutting into the remains of an older and far less understood system. The fair was supposed to celebrate innovation. Yet beneath its foundations there were hints of engineering that did not fit neatly into the story of innovation beginning there. And then, just as the discoveries seemed to be becoming more coherent, parts of the work were pushed back toward concealment. Sediment returned, sections were covered, certain areas were no longer explored as deeply. Officially, these decisions were framed as practical measures tied to deadlines, safety, and foundation stability. That explanation may be partly true. Large construction projects always involve compromise. But observers later noticed something unsettling about which features seemed to disappear first. Not the simplest debris, not the most obviously damaged remnants, the most unusual installations, the most technically puzzling, the structures that seemed hardest to classify. That pattern raises a question nobody has answered well. If the goal was just efficient construction, why were the most anomalous systems among the first to vanish, back beneath the fill? Why does it seem, at least from the surviving fragments, that the more advanced a discovery appeared, the less time it remained visible? By the end of this phase of the dredging, the waterfront no longer looked like neutral ground being prepared for a fair. It looked like a site that had briefly opened a door into a buried layer of history. A layer no one had expected, no one fully understood, and perhaps no one wanted to examine too closely once it became clear how disruptive it might be. When the crews pushed deeper into the bay floor, the discoveries stopped looking like awkward leftovers from an older industrial city and started looking like pieces of a system built according to rules no one on site could fully explain. That shift is what makes the 1915 dredging story so difficult to ignore. Strange objects can always be dismissed one at a time. A single tower can be called a support. A single chamber can be labelled debris. A single conduit can be blamed on forgotten construction. But when the same design logic appears again and again, spread across different excavation zones, that is when the ordinary explanation begins to lose its grip. What emerged next only made that problem worse. Workers began encountering enclosed chambers that did not resemble crude utility boxes or broken marine infrastructure. These were not the rough remains of wooden platforms or simple iron housings. They appeared geometrically deliberate, with cylindrical forms, balanced proportions, and a kind of internal order that suggested planned engineering rather than improvised construction. Some of the chambers were so dense and so thoroughly sealed inside hardened material that workers initially assumed they had struck natural stone. Only after breaking them open did they realize they were looking at enclosed interiors. And the interiors did not make the mystery easier. Accounts describe smooth metal walls, fitted components, and machinery-like arrangements that seemed unexpectedly well preserved. The impression given in later descriptions is that these spaces looked less like wreckage and more like something shut down and closed off long ago. Not smashed, not scattered, not ruined in the way one expects abandoned waterfront equipment to be ruined. Instead, some of it seemed almost protected by the layers that had buried it. That detail matters because buried machinery usually deteriorates unevenly. It warps, it breaks, it collapses into the surrounding environment. But these chambers gave the impression of coherence, as if they had been designed to remain intact even after submersion. And then came the structures that later became some of the most debated elements in the entire story, the tall resonance towers. Officially, these would later be softened into something more familiar: old pier supports, maritime foundations, possibly lighthouse-related structures, safe labels, reassuring labels, the kind of labels that close discussion before it begins. But the surviving descriptions do not sit comfortably with those explanations. These towers were said to be too symmetrical, too exact, and too mechanically purposeful to pass easily as ordinary waterfront construction. Some appear to have risen high enough that they may once have extended above the waterline before later burial or submersion. Others reportedly contained internal coil mechanisms or repeating structural elements that seemed intended for amplification or transmission rather than passive support. In private correspondence, a few observers described them in language closer to broadcast apparatus than harbour architecture. Not everyone agreed on what they were, but enough people sensed that they had an active rather than passive purpose. That difference is crucial. A support structure holds weight, a transmission structure does something, and the more these towers were examined, the more they seemed built to do something. Their geometry implied tuning, their internal arrangements implied function. Their relationship to surrounding conduits and grounding systems implied connection to a larger network. That is why later viewers keep coming back to them, because the towers make the entire site harder to explain as a collection of random, forgotten parts. The grounding systems were another major source of confusion. These were not simple metal elements driven into mud in the way workers might expect for ordinary electrical protection. In several cases, the grounding components appeared tied directly into the bedrock itself. They were embedded at unusual angles linked to horizontal runs, rather than simple vertical connections to surface structures, and positioned in ways that made little sense if their purpose had merely been lightning diversion or routine discharge control. In other words, they looked engineered for a specialized relationship with the earth beneath the bay. That is not the sort of thing most crews expected to uncover while preparing fill for exposition construction. And once those features were seen together, chambers, towers, grounding systems, conduits, the implications became increasingly uncomfortable, because now the exposition grounds above no longer seemed to rest on empty reclaimed land. They seemed to rest on top of something older and much more deliberate. The deeper the excavation went, the stranger the material evidence became. Some metal parts were described as having a remarkably uniform thickness. Certain surfaces seemed polished or finished to a degree that felt unusual for their supposed age. Threads and joins appeared so cleanly cut that even much later machinists would question what kind of tooling had produced them. These details by themselves do not prove a hidden civilization or impossible technology, but they do create a serious problem for the simple explanation that all of this was just familiar local infrastructure in an odd state of preservation. Then there were the insulators. This may be one of the most intriguing parts of the entire story, because insulators are not decorative details. They are functional evidence. They tell you that a system was built to manage energy in a controlled way. According to later accounts, some of the insulator-like components recovered during the dredging were made from ceramic compounds that engineers of the time struggled to classify. Others appeared to incorporate crystalline structures or material properties that did not match what workers expected from common industrial ceramics. The official explanations that followed were conveniently loose. Unusual imported material, mineral oddities, misidentified fragments. But those answers feel thin when the objects in question were not raw chunks of natural substance. They were shaped pieces, manufactured pieces, components integrated into a larger engineered design. That means whatever the material was, it had been selected, processed, and put to use intentionally. And that is where the ordinary timeline starts to strain. Because advanced material selection implies advanced design thinking. It implies knowledge of purpose. It implies a system built by people who understood exactly what kind of energy conditions their components needed to withstand. Once again, the bay floor was not just yielding up debris, it was hinting at a technological language. Then something else changed, and this shift may be the most telling of all. The work began to narrow. Sections that had revealed especially unusual features were covered back over. Chambers were filled again with sediment. Tower bases disappeared beneath new material. Deeper zones were isolated or left unexplored. Publicly, this could be described as routine construction management. Deadlines were real. The exposition had to move forward. Stable ground had to be created. In any project of that size, compromises are inevitable. But people looking back at the sequence of events noticed something difficult to ignore. The installations that seemed to vanish first were often the ones that appeared most anomalous. The resonance towers, the unusual insulators, the integrated grounding systems, the sealed chambers. The parts of the site that raised the biggest questions did not become the focus of wider study. They became the first to disappear. That pattern is hard to explain away. If the goal had only been speed, then the most complicated and least relevant material might have been set aside for later examination. If the goal had been documentation, the most unusual discoveries should have attracted the most careful technical analysis. Instead, the opposite seems to have happened. The deeper the mystery, the faster it was buried again. And by that point, the biggest question was no longer whether the crews had uncovered something unusual. That much seemed increasingly obvious. The real question had become whether they had accidentally exposed part of a much larger network, one extending beyond the exposition grounds themselves, because the conduits did not seem random. They appeared organized, directional, interconnected, less like isolated pipework and more like distribution routes. Not the broken remnants of a few forgotten installations, but pieces of a broader planned system. A system that may once have carried energy across a much wider area than anyone in 1915 was prepared to imagine. And just as that possibility began to come into view, the bay started closing over it again. By the final weeks of the 1915 land reclamation work, the tone of the surviving record had changed so much that it is difficult not to notice. In the earlier stages, the language of the dredging notes feels practical and direct. Crews describe sediment obstacles, structural remains, and excavation conditions, the way engineers usually do when they think they are dealing with manageable problems. But as the work moved deeper and the discoveries became more difficult to classify, that confidence seemed to fade. The dredging did not appear to end in the normal sense. It appeared to stop. That distinction matters. A project that is completed leaves behind the language of completion. Sections finished, objectives met, work concluded. But in this case, what emerges from the fragments is something more abrupt. The crews kept going until the finds became too strange, too interconnected, or too disruptive to the expected story. Then the record narrows, the language becomes guarded, and entire sections of what had been exposed are put back under sediment with surprising speed. It is in this late phase that the mystery sharpens. Because the final installations reportedly uncovered beneath the bay were not just unusual versions of familiar equipment, they were the pieces that pushed the whole discovery beyond the edge of comfortable explanation. Surviving descriptions speak of housings with tolerances so tight they seemed almost unnatural by the standards of the day. Components fitted with such precision that even later observers struggled to imagine them as ordinary harbour leftovers. Transmission chambers built on a scale that suggested serious energy movement, not minor signalling. Conduits stretching beyond the dredged zones and disappearing into darkness under the bay, as if what had been exposed was only a fragment of something much larger. And the most advanced-looking material was often the first to be covered again. That is one of the hardest patterns in the entire story to ignore. Workers describe chambers being filled back in almost immediately after exposure. Tower foundations were buried again. Sediment was packed into spaces that had only just been opened. This was not a slow fade caused by neglect. It was rapid, deliberate, efficient. The official explanation later leaned on practicalities, structural concerns, time pressure, the demands of preparing solid ground for the exposition. And yes, those concerns were real. No major construction project is free from them. But even so, the sequence is strange. If deadlines were the only issue, why were the most sophisticated installations reburied so quickly while simpler corroded material was sometimes left visible long enough to be photographed and summarized? Why would obviously damaged or ordinary debris remain available for the record, while the most technically puzzling structures disappeared first? If safety was the concern, why not isolate the most unusual systems for controlled study? If the discoveries were harmless and historically ordinary, why not document them in full before burying them? Those questions do not prove a cover-up in the dramatic sense people often imagine, but they do suggest something else, something quieter and perhaps more realistic. The deeper discoveries may have posed a threat, not to physical safety alone, but to historical certainty. They may have introduced evidence that no one involved was prepared to interpret within the accepted framework of American industrial development. And when institutions encounter something that does not fit the story they are built to tell, one common response is not confrontation. It is minimization. Reduce the description, narrow the record, classify broadly, move on. That pattern would explain a lot. Because if the infrastructure beneath San Francisco Bay really did display engineering features beyond what early 20th century observers expected, and if those features did not clearly belong to any known local company municipal system or documented experiment, then the problem was much larger than one construction delay. The problem was that the accepted timeline itself began to look unstable. Think about what that would mean. San Francisco in 1915 was supposed to be presenting itself as a triumphant symbol of modern progress. The exposition existed to celebrate achievement, innovation, and national confidence. It was a performance of technological modernity. But beneath the fairgrounds, workers may have been uncovering signs of a system that looked strangely advanced, strangely old, and strangely disconnected from the official development story of the city above. That is the kind of contradiction institutions do not handle gracefully. Because once you admit the contradiction, the next questions arrive quickly. If this grid was not part of ordinary recorded infrastructure, then who built it? If it predated the exposition, did it also predate the earthquake? If it predated the earthquake, did it predate the modern city itself? If it was truly designed for some form of wireless or resonant energy transmission, then why does the documented history of American electrical progress say so little about anything remotely comparable in that location? And if the Bay Floor held one such system, what else might lie beneath other waterfront cities that were dredged, filled, rebuilt, and paved over during the great age of urban expansion? Those questions are destabilizing, especially if you are trying to stage a World's Fair and reassure the public with a clean story of recovery and progress. The surviving photographs only deepen that tension. In them, workers stand beside towers that do not feel comfortably antique. Some of the components look uncannily modern in silhouette. Certain arrangements resemble Tesla-like forms or experimental resonant devices long before such shapes became part of popular technological imagination. That does not mean the structures were literally Tesla coils in the textbook sense, but visually they evoke the same family of ideas strongly enough to make the ordinary explanation feel weak. And yet, despite how visually striking some of those installations appear to be, historians and official publications have rarely dwelled on them in detail. That silence is itself part of the story. Because history is not just about what gets recorded, it is also about what gets reduced, summarized, and quietly pushed to the margins. A photograph can survive while its meaning is stripped away. A note can remain in an archive while the implications are ignored. A strange discovery can be preserved on paper and still effectively disappear if every formal narrative treats it as trivial. That may be exactly what happened here. The deeper systems beneath the bay may not have vanished because every physical trace was destroyed. They may have vanished because they were administratively neutralized, labeled in bland language, folded into harmless categories, buried beneath the momentum of a much larger and more attractive civic story. But the pattern remains visible if you look closely enough. The resonance towers were buried again. The wireless transmission light chambers were buried again. The unfamiliar insulators were buried again. The integrated conduits were buried again. And even the photographic trail seems to thin around the most revealing evidence, almost as though the land reclamation project had briefly exposed a layer of history no one wanted to explore in public. What makes this so compelling is not just the possibility that unusual technology was found, it is the possibility that what was found did not belong to the timeline we think we know. The structures beneath the bay seem to hint at an engineering tradition that was already mature when it was buried. Not experimental in the early modern sense, not clumsy, not transitional, mature, standardized, intentional. And if that is true, then the real mystery is not only what the crews uncovered in 1915, it is why the city chose to build directly on top of it and keep going. Because once you step back and look at the whole sequence, a larger possibility comes into view. Perhaps the bay floor was not just convenient ground to reclaim. Perhaps it was also a burial layer, a place where older systems had already been sealed beneath mud silt and time long before the exposition arrived. The fair did not create the concealment. It may simply have renewed it. For one brief moment, the dredging opened that buried layer again. The bay gave up just enough to reveal towers, chambers, conduits, and materials that did not fit neatly into the accepted story. Then the sediment returned, the foundations rose, the public looked upward, and the deeper history slipped back out of sight. And that is where the final question begins. Not what the crews saw, not even what they suspected, but what else may still be down there, extending far beyond the limited zones that 1915 workers accidentally exposed? Because once you allow for that possibility, the story stops being only about San Francisco. It becomes about every port city, every reclaimed shoreline, every harbor that was dredged, filled, rebuilt, and declared modern without anyone seriously asking what older systems might have been buried underneath. San Francisco is compelling because the 1915 work happened at such a visible historical moment. The city was presenting itself as renewed, polished, and forward-looking. Above ground there was celebration. Beneath the waterline there may have been evidence of something older, more advanced in certain ways, and deeply inconvenient to the official narrative. That is what gives the story its lasting power. If the structures beneath the bay were merely scraps of forgotten waterfront construction, then the mystery ends there. Strange perhaps, but manageable. Yet the surviving fragments do not point toward a simple ending. They point toward continuity, repetition, standardization. A system that may have extended far beyond the few zones touched during the Exposition-era dredging. Consider the conduits. Again and again, later interpretations of the surviving material return to the same uncomfortable detail. The conduits seemed to run with purpose. They did not look like broken pipe sections tossed around by disaster. They did not seem like improvised channels installed in unrelated phases. They looked aligned, planned, connected. In some descriptions, they are said to continue beyond the excavation limits, heading out beneath the bay floor, as though the exposed sections were only branches of a larger network. That possibility changes everything, because a few strange installations can always be dismissed as local anomalies. A true network cannot be dismissed so easily. A network implies scale. It implies original planning. It implies a source and a destination. It implies that whatever these structures once did, they were not isolated experiments. They were part of a coordinated design. And if that design once served some form of energy transmission, then the implications are enormous. This is where the comparison to Tesla keeps surfacing in later discussions, even when people try to be cautious. It is not necessarily because the 1915 finds can be literally identified as Tesla systems in a strict historical sense. It is because the forms described and photographed seem to echo ideas associated with resonant transmission, tuned structures grounding through the earth, and the possibility of distributing energy without the kind of visible cable networks people expect. That resemblance is what unsettles people. Not a perfect match, but a family resemblance. Enough to make the accepted timeline feel incomplete. Enough to raise the question of whether wireless power or something close to it was imagined, attempted, or even implemented in ways that later history chose not to emphasize. And yet even that may be too narrow a frame, because what the workers appear to have encountered did not simply look experimental. If anything, one of the most striking features of the story is how finished the buried systems seemed. The chambers were laid out coherently. The towers appeared symmetrical and deliberate. The grounding systems looked integrated from the beginning. The materials were selected with purpose. This was not the visual language of a half-failed prototype. It was the visual language of infrastructure. That is a very different thing. A prototype is awkward, improvised, incomplete. Infrastructure assumes function. It assumes that the problems have already been solved well enough to build at scale. So if the buried structures really were part of some older transmission system, then we may not be looking at an experiment lost to history. We may be looking at the remains of a working grid, one that belonged to a developmental path the official record does not preserve. And that raises the hardest question of all. How does something like that disappear? Not physically, of course. Physical disappearance is easy. Cities bury things all the time. Harbors swallow structures. Landfill covers coastlines. Sediment accumulates. Reconstruction hides what came before. But historical disappearance is different. Historical disappearance requires that records thin out, explanations narrow, curiosity cool, and categories harden around the safest possible interpretation. That is why the silence around the 1915 discoveries matters just as much as the discoveries themselves. The silence suggests that the problem was not only what had been found, but what it might force people to reconsider if taken seriously. If municipal engineers, contractors, and technical observers had publicly acknowledged that the bay floor contained a buried and unusually advanced energy-related system of unclear origin, the consequences would not have remained limited to one city. Newspapers would have seized it, researchers would have pressed for more excavation. Rival cities might have reviewed their own waterfront histories. The exposition itself might have become overshadowed by the far bigger story under its own foundations. That did not happen. Instead, the public got the clean version, a triumphant city, a glittering fair, a celebration of progress, and whatever lay beneath remained mostly in fragments. There is another detail worth lingering on here. The structures were not only buried again, they were buried at a moment when modern urban confidence was expanding rapidly. The early 20th century was full of big systems, electrical networks, transportation grids, communication webs, and engineering projects that made cities feel newly powerful. In that atmosphere, people wanted a story of ascent. They wanted progress to look recent, linear, and humanly controlled. They wanted modernity to feel like something they had just invented and were now mastering. A buried older system would complicate that story in an almost unbearable way, because if a more integrated energy network had existed before then, modern infrastructure was no longer a triumphant beginning. It was a recovery, a rediscovery, or perhaps a diminished echo of something that had already been done differently. That possibility is not easy for official histories to absorb, and maybe that is why the rhetoric surrounding the finds became so tame. Maritime debris, earlier equipment, old supports, telegraph remnants. These are not neutral labels, they are containment labels. They turn anomaly into familiarity. They stop deeper questions from multiplying. They allow institutions to move on. But the visual and structural evidence, limited as it is, keeps resisting that containment. The towers do not feel like simple leftovers. The sealed chambers do not feel random. The unusual ceramics and crystalline insulators do not feel like harmless oddities. The conduits do not feel accidental. Taken together, they create a picture that is hard to reduce to routine harbor clutter. And then there is the geography. San Francisco is not just any city. It sits on a dramatic edge of land and water, with a bay that has been repeatedly reshaped by human ambition. Shorelines shifted, marshes filled, docks rebuilt, entire zones transformed. That kind of landscape is perfect for burying difficult history, not because anyone needs to conspire in some theatrical way, but because rapid redevelopment naturally covers what it does, not pause to understand. Mud-fill, concrete, timber, steel, and time do the work together. Once the exposition moved forward, once the fairgrounds rose, once the narrative of rebirth locked into place, the deeper discoveries no longer had much room to breathe. They became subnotes to a larger civic performance. Anyone who had seen the strange installations firsthand might have remembered them. A few might have mentioned them carefully in correspondence. But institutional momentum was already moving in another direction. Upward, forward, public. Not downward, not backward. And certainly not into a version of history that suggested the bay floor might hold the remains of an older technological world. That is why the 1915 discoveries continue to provoke such fascination now. Not because they hand us clear answers. They do not. The archive is too thin for that. The photographs are too few. The language is too cautious. But precisely because the record is incomplete, the surviving fragments have a strange power. They point just far enough beyond the official explanation to keep the mystery alive. A city preparing to celebrate its modern future may have briefly opened a wound in the past. And when that past looked too organized, too advanced, and too difficult to explain, the wound was closed again. Filled, covered, built over. Which means the real story may still be waiting exactly where the dredging crews left it, beneath the reclaimed edges of the bay, under layers of sediment and stone, under the memory of the fair itself, under a city that may never have fully understood what it was standing on. And that brings us to the deepest and most unsettling part of the entire story. If the 1915 dredging really did expose the remains of a buried energy system beneath San Francisco Bay, then the biggest mystery is not simply what was found. It is why the discovery seems to echo a pattern that appears in city after city, though usually in quieter, more fragmented ways. Waterfronts are among the most heavily reworked landscapes on Earth. Harbours get dredged, shorelines get filled, old foundations vanish under new construction. Each generation assumes it is building on raw practicality, when in reality it may be building on layers of forgotten intention. That possibility changes how you look at San Francisco. The city is usually framed as a place of rupture and renewal. The earthquake, the fire, the rebuilding, the exposition, the rise of modern infrastructure. It is a story of dramatic breaks, as though each disaster cleared the board and allowed the next phase to begin fresh. But what if the board was never actually cleared? What if the visible city kept changing while something far older remained beneath it? Hidden, not because it had vanished completely, but because no one was prepared to recognize it for what it was. That would explain a great deal. It would explain why the buried structures appeared integrated rather than improvised. It would explain why their geometry felt standardized across different zones. It would explain why some materials and fittings looked oddly advanced to the workers who encountered them. It would explain why the conduits seemed to continue beyond the excavated areas, as if the crews had only brushed against the edge of a much larger network. Most of all, it would explain why the response to the deepest finds appears to have been so restrained, so selective, and so quick to return them to the dark. Because sometimes the easiest way to handle a discovery that does not fit is not to destroy it. It is to reclassify it, rebury it, and move on. That is exactly what the pattern from 1915 suggests. The most anomalous structures were not turned into the centerpiece of a new engineering investigation. They were not widely publicized. They were not displayed to the public as signs of a forgotten chapter in the city's development. They were absorbed into construction logistics, folded into bland technical language, and sealed beneath the very project that was supposed to symbolize modern progress. The symbolism there is almost too perfect. A World's Fair celebrating innovation rises over a buried system of unexplained engineering. A city announces its rebirth while literally covering over evidence that might complicate its official story of becoming modern. Visitors walk pavilions and admire electric spectacle, while somewhere below chamber walls, tower bases, grounded conduits, and precision-made components disappear again beneath artificial land. That is why this story feels bigger than one set of photographs or one batch of engineering notes. It touches something fundamental about how history works. History is not just a record of what happened. It is a record of what institutions choose to emphasize. It is shaped by what gets turned into monuments and what gets turned into footnotes. When evidence supports the dominant narrative, it is celebrated. When evidence strains the dominant narrative, it is often managed. Not always through dramatic suppression. Often through something much quieter: delay, vagueness, classification, loss of urgency, administrative indifference, the slow burial of a problem no one wants to own. The 1915 dredging story has all the signs of that quieter process. You can see it in the shrinking detail of the reports. You can see it in the way certain structures seem to vanish from later descriptions. You can see it in the contrast between what surviving photographs suggest and how mild the official labels later became. You can even see it in the physical sequence itself. Exposure, confusion, narrowing of language reburial. It is a familiar pattern once you know how to look for it. And that is why the surviving visual record remains so important. Even if it is incomplete, even if some interpretations go too far, the photographs interrupt the safe official story. They show scale, they show form, they show workers standing beside installations that do not look comfortably like random debris. They show arrangements that appear repeated, intentional, and structurally coherent. They do not answer every question, but they prevent the easy answer from feeling sufficient. That may be the most powerful thing surviving evidence can do. Not solve the mystery, but keep it open. Because once the possibility remains open, larger connections begin to emerge. You start asking how many other cities may have encountered similar anomalies during major dredging or reclamation work, and simply absorb them into the language of construction. You start wondering whether certain forgotten waterfront supports or foundations in archival photographs from other regions might deserve a second look. You begin to see how urban development itself can function as a kind of historical eraser, not because every builder is hiding something, but because rapid growth rewards forward motion, not deep excavation of inconvenient pasts. And from that perspective, San Francisco becomes a case study in a much wider phenomenon. A city cuts into its shoreline to create a modern showcase. In doing so, it briefly reveals traces of an older system embedded in the earth beneath the bay. The system appears technologically meaningful. The workers notice. Some record it. some photograph it. But the city is on a schedule. The exposition must open. The narrative of recovery must remain clear. So the mystery is not explored to its end. It is interrupted, translated into safer language, and covered by the next layer of progress. That may be how entire chapters of history disappear, not in a single dramatic act, but beneath deadlines, civic ambition, and the comforting belief that anything truly important would already be in the books. Yet the books are often late to the truth. Sometimes the ground knows first. And in 1915, for a brief moment, the ground under San Francisco seems to have said something the official record still does not know how to repeat clearly. It suggested that the city's waterfront may have been built over the remains of a sophisticated energy-related infrastructure. It suggested that at least some parts of that infrastructure did not fit comfortably within the standard story of local industrial growth. And it suggested, most unsettling of all, that the people who saw it may have understood enough to realize how disruptive it could be if taken seriously. So they stopped, or were made to stop, or simply lost the institutional permission to keep asking. However you phrase it, the effect was the same. The excavation narrowed, the material vanished, the fair moved forward, the city looked upward, and the bay closed over its secret again. That is why the final question still lingers with such force. Not whether something unusual was found. The surviving fragments make that difficult to deny. Not even whether the official explanation is incomplete. It almost certainly is. The real question is how much of the buried system was never exposed at all, how far the conduits ran, whether the towers were isolated nodes or part of a continuous line, whether similar chambers still sit beneath later landfill, under roads, under piers, under neighborhoods that never imagined what lay below their foundations. Because if the 1915 crews only touched the outer edge of a larger network, then the true scale of the discovery was never even measured. It was interrupted before it could be, and that possibility leaves San Francisco in a very different light. Not just as a city of spectacle and recovery, but as a city built atop an unanswered technical mystery. A place where modern civic pride may have literally settled over the remains of an older chapter of engineering history, one that surfaced for an instant, startled the people who saw it, and then disappeared back under the reclaimed edge of the world. And once you reach that point, the mystery no longer feels like a curiosity from an old engineering archive. It starts to feel like a challenge to the way we usually tell technological history itself. We like clean timelines. We like neat development arcs. We like the idea that progress moves in a straight line from crude beginnings to polished modern systems, with every important step documented, patented, displayed and taught. But stories like this refuse that comfort. They suggest that history may be far less linear than we pretend. That is what makes the 1915 San Francisco dredging story so persistent. It is not only that workers appear to have uncovered strange towers, sealed chambers, unusual insulators, and buried conduits beneath the bay. It is that these finds point toward a form of engineering maturity. That word matters. Maturity. Not invention in progress. Not clumsy experimentation. Not a workshop prototype. What keeps surfacing in the descriptions is balanced standardization, symmetry, fit integration. The language of a system that seems already solved. And if that impression is even partly correct, then the standard explanation becomes harder and harder to defend. Because mature systems do not appear out of nowhere. They come from long development. They come from trial, refinement, iteration, failure, redesign, and eventual standardization. If the structures beneath the bay really reflected a coherent approach to energy transmission, especially one involving resonant or wireless principles, then their existence implies a whole missing chapter behind them, a chapter of experimentation, deployment, maintenance, and use, a chapter the accepted record does not clearly contain. That gap is enormous. It means the real issue may not be a few unexplained artifacts. It may be the absence of an entire technological lineage from the official story. And once you start thinking in those terms, even the silence around the 1915 discoveries begins to look different. Perhaps the finds were not merely strange. Perhaps they were dangerous in a very specific intellectual sense. They hinted at a missing lineage. They hinted that the timeline people trusted was incomplete. That kind of suggestion can be more disruptive than any physical hazard. Imagine being an engineer in 1915 working under pressure, tasked with preparing land for one of the biggest civic showcases in the country. You expect mud timber-filled rubble, maybe older dock remains. Instead, you uncover aligned installations whose geometry seems intentional, whose materials seem unfamiliar, and whose function appears related to energy distribution in ways you cannot place. At first, you might think you are misreading the site. Then the same patterns appear again somewhere else. Then a tower aligns with a conduit. Then a chamber connects to a grounded element embedded in bedrock. At some point, the simplest explanation stops feeling simple. What do you do then? Most people imagine a dramatic reaction. Alarm, public scandal, emergency meetings. But reality often works differently. In complex institutions, uncertainty tends to produce caution before it produces revelation. People hedge. They shorten descriptions. They avoid making claims they cannot support. They default to the least disruptive label available. That is especially true when the discovery cuts against a major public narrative already in motion. And San Francisco in 1915 absolutely had such a narrative. The city was not looking for a buried technological puzzle. It was looking for a triumphant presentation of itself. The exposition mattered symbolically. It was meant to showcase modernity, resilience, beauty, national strength. Everything about it pulled attention upward, outward, forward. The last thing such a project needed was a competing story emerging from the mud below a story implying that the ground beneath the fair held traces of an unknown engineered past. So the excavation results, at least the most unsettling ones, never fully became public knowledge in the way they might have under different circumstances. Instead, they were absorbed into technical channels, trimmed down, redistributed as manageable fragments, and ultimately buried again, both physically and narratively. That double burial may be the most important fact of all. First, the structures were sealed again under sediment and fill. Then they were sealed in language. Once something is given a harmless label, its power shrinks. Once a tower becomes an old support, once a chamber becomes debris, once a conduit becomes a remnant of forgotten harbour work, the deeper questions lose momentum. Even when photographs survive later, readers are guided away from the unsettling interpretation before they have fully looked. The archive remains open in theory but closed in practice. People see only what the label permits them to see. That is how historical mysteries endure in plain sight. Not because the evidence vanishes completely, but because it is domesticated, rendered dull, folded into the ordinary. The documents remain, but the frame around them becomes too narrow to let the real implications breathe. And yet the San Francisco story keeps resisting that narrowing. It keeps pushing back because too many elements refuse to become mundane at the same time. The alignment of installations, the precision of the components, the oddity of the materials, the resonance-like towers, the bedrock grounding systems, the conduits extending beyond the dredged zones, the selective reburial. None of these alone would be enough. Together, they form a pressure on the official explanation that never fully goes away. That pressure leads to another disturbing possibility. What if the buried grid beneath San Francisco was not unique? That question is where this story starts to widen into something much larger. If one major harbour city accidentally exposed signs of an older energy-related system during land reclamation, then the same may have happened elsewhere, without attracting lasting attention. Think about how many waterfronts were dramatically reshaped in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Think about how much dredging filling, blasting, piling, paving and rebuilding took place around the world in the name of commerce and expansion. Entire coastlines were transformed. Bays were straightened, marshes vanished. Old layers went under new ones in a matter of years. How much was seen in those processes and then reduced to convenient categories? How many strange finds were written off as old maritime infrastructure simply because no one had a better official label ready? How many photographs sit in obscure engineering files showing structures that later generations never paused to question? San Francisco may matter not only because of what was found there, but because it offers a model for how such discoveries could disappear elsewhere. A strange system is uncovered. Workers note its unusual features. Some photographs are taken. Officials need the project to proceed. Public attention is focused somewhere else. The material is reburied. The descriptions are generalized. The archive scatters. Decades pass. What remains is just enough to suggest a mystery, but not enough to force a mainstream reckoning. That pattern feels uncomfortably plausible. And if it is plausible, then the buried waterfront beneath San Francisco stops being an isolated curiosity and starts looking like a warning. A warning that the landscapes we think we understand may be far less transparent than they appear. A warning that modern cities can grow over technological layers they never truly examine. A warning that official history tends to privilege what was successfully integrated into public narrative, not necessarily what was actually there. This is where the emotional force of the story really lands, because beneath all the technical details there is something haunting about the image itself. Men standing knee-deep in muck and machinery, surrounded by the noise of dredging and construction, suddenly realizing that what they are uncovering may not belong to the story they thought they were living in. Above them, a city preparing to celebrate its future. Beneath them, the remains of something that may have belonged to another future entirely, one that was interrupted, submerged, and almost erased. That image stays with you. It stays with you because it captures a tension we rarely admit. Modernity likes to believe it is the first clear version of intelligence the world has produced. It likes to imagine that earlier systems were always cruder, always more primitive, always obviously beneath it. But what if some earlier systems were sophisticated in ways we do not easily recognize anymore? What if they solve problems differently? What if traces of those solutions still exist beneath the places we have rebuilt most aggressively? That is the possibility buried under the San Francisco story. Not certainty, not proof in the simplistic sense, but possibility with structure, possibility with photographic residue, possibility with engineering detail, possibility that refuses to disappear completely no matter how often it is categorized, minimized, or covered over. And once that possibility takes hold, one final shift happens. You stop asking only what was buried beneath the bay in 1915. You start asking who benefited from not looking longer. Once you start asking that question, the entire story sharpens into something much more unsettling, because history is never shaped only by what is discovered. It is also shaped by who has the power to decide what a discovery means, how long it remains visible, and whether it becomes part of the public story at all. In 1915, San Francisco had every incentive to keep its attention fixed on the future. The city was staging a global performance of recovery. The exposition was supposed to prove that disaster had been overcome, that civilization had advanced, that modern engineering and civic vision had triumphed. That was the story being sold to visitors, investors, newspapers, and the world. A buried technological mystery beneath the waterfront did not belong in that story. Not unless it could be safely neutralized, and that may be exactly what happened. Not necessarily through some dramatic secret order, not through a theatrical conspiracy in the way people often imagine, but through something much more ordinary and much more believable. Institutional filtering, practical pressure, selective documentation, the quiet choice to treat a confusing discovery as an inconvenience rather than an invitation. The decision to keep the project moving, keep the public narrative clean, and let the deeper questions sink back into the mud. That is how entire chapters of the past can disappear without ever being formally erased. They get buried by momentum. And the momentum in San Francisco in 1915 was enormous. A city rebuilding itself. A World's Fair on a deadline. Massive engineering works underway. Officials trying to present order, beauty, and confidence. Under those conditions, anything that complicated the narrative would have been handled in the most manageable way possible. The strange towers become old supports. The transmission chambers become obscure debris. The anomalous insulators become odd imported material. The connected conduits become forgotten utility remnants. The photographs get scattered. The reports get shortened. The work continues. Above ground, the city glows. Below ground, the questions go dark. And yet they never disappear completely. That is why the 1915 discoveries still matter. Not because they hand us a perfectly documented alternative history. They do not. Too much was left unexplained. Too much was reburied. Too much was filtered through cautious language. But what remains is enough to force a more uncomfortable kind of thinking. Enough to suggest that the waterfront did not simply conceal random debris from an earlier stage of local construction. enough to suggest that at least some of what was uncovered belonged to an organized technological system, enough to suggest that this system may have been more sophisticated, more integrated, and perhaps older than the official narrative allows. And if that is true, then the real significance of 1915 is not just that workers found something strange. It is that they found something that may have belonged to a different version of technological history entirely. A version in which energy infrastructure did not develop in the neat sequence we are taught. A version in which transmission systems may have been explored, implemented, or inherited in forms later forgotten. A version in which cities like San Francisco were not only building modernity, but building over the remains of something that had already confronted similar problems in a different way. That idea is difficult to prove cleanly, but it is also difficult to forget once you have seen the pattern. The towers buried again first, the chambers closed again first, the most advanced-looking materials pushed back under sediment first. The record thinning precisely where the story becomes most interesting. The final notes growing cautious. The excavation ending not with a satisfying explanation, but with a narrowing of vision. That is not what resolution looks like. That is what abandonment looks like. Or perhaps more accurately, that is what controlled forgetting looks like. And controlled forgetting is one of the most powerful forces in history. Not because it destroys every trace, but because it leaves behind only fragments. Fragments that can always be dismissed unless someone is willing to line them up and look at them as a whole. A single photo can be brushed aside, a vague report can be ignored, an unusual material can be reclassified. But when the photographs, the notes, the engineering anomalies, the geometry, and the reburial all point in the same direction, something else begins to emerge. Not certainty, but pattern. And pattern is often where real historical unease begins. Because once you see the pattern in San Francisco, you cannot help extending it outward. How many other cities rebuilt their shorelines over buried systems they never fully understood? How many reclamation projects covered evidence that did not fit the developmental story of the modern age? How many harbors, bays, riverfronts, and docklands now sit over traces of infrastructure that later generations casually labeled and forgot? The world has remade its waterfronts again and again. In doing so, it may also have buried some of its most inconvenient memories. That is why the San Francisco case lingers so powerfully. It is not only a local mystery, it is a template, a glimpse of how the past can surface accidentally disrupt the confidence of the present for a brief moment, and then be pushed back under by the demands of progress. The city did not stop to understand what the bay had revealed. It could not, or would not. The exposition had to proceed. The narrative had to remain intact. So the deeper layer was sealed over, and the brighter layer above became the official memory. That choice still shapes how the story is told. We remember the fairgrounds. We remember the architecture. We remember the Tower of Jewels and the spectacle of rebirth. We do not usually remember the buried towers beneath the bay floor, the sealed chambers, the strange insulators, the aligned conduits, or the engineers quietly confronting installations that seem to belong to no accepted chapter of the city's history. Those details remain at the edges where unsettling things are often kept. But sometimes the edges matter more than the center. Sometimes the footnotes are where the real fracture lines run. And in this case, the fracture line is clear. For one brief stretch in 1915, San Francisco's waterfront opened just enough to expose a hidden layer of engineered complexity beneath the city's modern ambitions. The workers saw enough to know it was not ordinary. The surviving record preserves enough to suggest it was not random. And the response tells us enough to understand that whatever had been uncovered was easier to bury than to explain. That may be the final truth of the story. Not that every answer is known, but that the reaction itself is evidence. The speed of the reburial is evidence. The narrowing language is evidence. The selective survival of photographs is evidence. The persistent mismatch between the sophistication of what appears to have been found and the simplicity of the official explanation is evidence. It all points to the same conclusion. In 1915, San Francisco may have briefly uncovered the remains of a buried energy grid, one whose design materials and structure challenged the accepted timeline strongly enough that the safest response was silence and sediment. The bay revealed it for a moment. The city built over it again. And what survives today is not a fully solved mystery, but something more haunting than that. A glimpse A glimpse of a history just beneath the surface, waiting under mudstone and foundations. A glimpse of a technological past that may not be gone at all, only covered. A glimpse that raises one last question that no official report ever answered. Not just what was found beneath San Francisco in 1915, but how much of the world we call modern is standing on top of something older, stranger, and far more advanced than we were ever told.